Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're going to be talking about 1989. Before we get into it, though, make sure you hit that like button, check to see if you're subscribed, and as always, leave us a comment. That helps us out with the algorithm, but more importantly, we love hearing from you guys. We've got an awesome community here, and it's all thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, all that said, let's dive into it. So, 1989 is the first appearance of Tim Drake as Robin. And the story of what he does is actually in his first appearance, that is, it wouldn't take that long for me to explain it. So going into this, I've been spending about the last week thinking about how to approach this episode of the podcast, and I realized that the real story is actually the 1989 Michael Keaton movie. And then on top of that, I realized that really to adequately set that up, I need to talk a little bit briefly about what Batman was like before the movie came out because based on your comments, that I've gotten over the course of doing this podcast, there are a lot of listeners who are the same age that I am. And they have similar experiences to my experiences, although I've learned that things are more regional than I expected. So, something that was true of me growing up in the part of the United States where I grew up is not, say, the same experience that my friend Troy had as a kid in the Chicago area, or my friend Vince had in New York. And you know what I mean? Just everybody had a different kind of a thing going on. So for me, I grew up in the absolute middle of nowhere on a farm, right? And we had bats in the farmhouse where I grew up. I cannot remember an age when there weren't bats hanging around. And the way it worked for us was they call it wetlands now, which we kind of laugh at. It's just a swamp, but not too far from our house. And I don't mean as in miles, I mean as in like a couple 100 feet. There was this one hill, and the bottom of the hill, anytime it rained, it just held water down there. And sometimes it was real swampy. And then if there was a year like 1989, for instance, was a big drought, that area was just like a field at that point. It was totally dried up. But for those years where it was wet, the mosquitoes were terrible. And it was like you could hardly play outdoors. The mosquitoes were so bad. They were just eating you alive, right? But what I thought was really cool was on the way our farmhouse was built, the roof went up to kind of like a point, and right there where like those two sections of roof would meet the wall, like the side of the farmhouse. There at that top, there was just sort of like a triangular hole there, right? And that's where the bats lived. And so as soon as the sun would dip down below the horizon line, uh the bats would come out of the farmhouse, and it was just like a huge black cloud. I have no idea if it would be like hundreds of bats or thousands of bats or whatever. I'm horrible at guessing things like that. But it's just this cloud would come out of the farmhouse, and it was, screeching and all that stuff, of course, like you would expect. And what they were doing was, of course, they were using echolocation to find those mosquitoes, right? And my grandparents would say it's like freeze tag, it's a game. The bats are going to play a game with you. And so don't move. As soon as you hear them, singing their song, I think is what my grandma said. He's like, you just freeze in place and don't move. And so I would, and I'd be out running and playing and whatever, and that would happen. The bats would come out, so I would just freeze. And if I had like say a mosquito on my arm, a bat would swoop down and get the mosquito in its mouth without ever touching me, right? And they would eat all the mosquitoes everywhere, and then they were gone. They left to go do bat things somewhere else, you know? And so I loved bats, right? Because I hated mosquitoes. And I'm like, well, the mosquitoes are obviously bothering me. The bats seem to be on my side, right? So bats are awesome. That was my take on it as a kid. And so for me personally, I never associated the bats with like fear, right? So, and then here's the other thing is where I lived, and I've mentioned this in some other videos, it was extremely hard to even find a place that sold comic books, right? It was, I'm sure if you lived in, like I mentioned, cities like Chicago and New York and stuff like that, things are more accessible in that kind of a situation, right? But for me as a kid in like the early 80s and the mid 80s and stuff like that, you just couldn't find him anywhere. It was very, very hard. There were a couple places, but they were so off the beaten path, it took me a while to even find them. But but at any rate, so Batman comic books were not something I was stumbling upon, okay? For me, Batman, the only exposure I was getting to the character was on Super Friends. And everybody that I knew back then was in the same boat. The only Batman they knew was on Super Friends. And it's interesting. I mentioned Troy on his channel the other night. There was this came up again, which Troy was arguing that superheroes have superpowers and that therefore a character like, say, Batman, he thinks is not a superhero. I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth. If he's listening, feel free to correct me if I'm misquoting you. Um, but there was this whole discussion, right, about what is a superhero, that kind of thing. So in that vein, when I was a kid, I do remember all the kids just assumed that it was kind of baked into the genre that if you were called a superhero, you therefore had powers, right? And so when we would watch Super Friends and we'd watch Batman, I feel like me and all of my friends were always waiting on that moment for him to reveal what his powers were. And of course, it never came, right? We were waiting on him to fly or have sonar or speak with bats or something like that. And it never happened. So we didn't get it. And the thing is that I think a lot of younger listeners are going to have a hard time imagining this. In the world I grew up in, Batman was considered the worst superhero of all time. Literally. Like people liked Aquaman more than Batman where I grew up because at least Aquaman could swim at super speed and talk to fish and, things like that. So we just didn't get it. And for me, like I said, I had bats on the farm and they just seemed like harmless creatures in my environment, like a squirrel or something like that would. So to me, Batman was like Squirrel Man, right? I just didn't get it, you know? So I was never a Batman fan. And then anytime there was a comic book around with Batman in it, I had no desire to pick it up, right? Because I was like, it's Batman, I hate Batman. And everybody I knew hated Batman. And then came the news that they were making the 1989 Batman movie. That was the first thing I remember hearing. And I can't remember if it was like in People magazine or something like that. But the way they framed it was Mr. Mom is going to play Batman. And I had not seen Mr. Mom at the time. I knew people who did, and I remember asking them, like, "Hey, I heard Mr. Mom's playing Batman," and other kids would be like, "Yeah." And I'd be like, "Is Mr. Mom any good? Like the movie?" And they'd be like, "No, not really." And I was like, "Oh, that kinda sucks." So it's like a sucky actor is gonna play a sucky character, huh? Like, that was how we were that's where we were at in, like, I don't know if it'd be 1987? 'Cause in 1988, we start to get set photos and stuff. because they're filming it, right? So that there was like this there were these moments. So when you hear the movies coming, that's sort of like phase 1 or whatever, everybody was against it. Everybody thought it sounded horrible. It's kinda like this is probably another thing that several listeners will be too young to remember, but when they announced that Ben Affleck was going to play Batman, the internet, like, exploded. I think they announced it on, like, a Friday or something, and, like, all weekend long was, like, memes and stuff about how much Ben Affleck sucks and stuff like that. So if we had the internet back in the '80s, right, um, I think it would have been the same way. I think the internet would have exploded. It would just been a ton of people saying Michael Keaton sucks and Batman sucks and so on and so forth, you know? And I think that if the studio then worked the way they do now, I feel like there's a chance they would have just canceled the movie. And it never would have happened. And we never would have had Batman the animated series or just, any of this other stuff. But at any rate, thankfully that's not how that went. Despite the public opinion, the studio seemed, at least to me, to have confidence in what they were doing, and they kept pushing forward, right? And then you get to phase 2, which is interviews and set photos. And I can't remember now who they were interviewing. I don't know if it was Tim Burton, because it wasn't Michael Keaton, I don't think. I wanna say it was maybe Tim Burton. And the interesting thing is the way they pitched it is not at all how most people talk about the Batman movie, I don't think. I remember the first thing I heard was they said, "This is a revenge story." And the way they framed it was the guy who's being interviewed looks right into the camera, and he's like, "Have you ever had anybody wrong you?" And he starts naming off examples, whether he's talking to women that maybe their boss is a creep, or maybe it's kids who are watching and they get bullied at school or whatever, you know? But he's trying to get people to connect, right? And I actually think this is, like, the first really big moment that swayed public opinion, and I remember watching this on TV and being like, "Oh, yeah, like, I've definitely had people wrong me," you know? And it just appealed to that thing in everybody, I think, that everybody would like to kinda have revenge. You might stop yourself from doing it or whatever, you know what I mean? Most people don't act on it. But of course, that's kind of where movies come in, as they kind of still scratch those itches. You see stuff in movies that you wouldn't dare do yourself, but you get it. So then you get the next phase of it is we start getting little clips. And I remember the first clip I ever saw is from the end of the movie when the Batwing is coming in to grab all those balloons. And I remember thinking that looked pretty awesome. Um, and so I remember getting like they were building up hype for this movie so that in 1988 they were building up the hype for a movie that wasn't gonna come out for at least a year. And like Entertainment Tonight really, really, really was covering the Batman movie, and like everybody was talking about the Batman movie. And in like the hype level, I have never ever seen it on any other movie at all ever since. Um, as maybe in second place, I would say Marvel's Infinity stuff that they were doing with Thanos. But even then, because like I remember going to the zoo the summer of 1989. There was a drought that year where I lived, and usually our idea of a hot summer day is like 85 or 90 degrees. You know what I mean? And on this particular day at the zoo, it was in the hundreds. It was like, I don't know, 105 degrees or something like that. But I remember going to the zoo, and at this point, the Michael Keaton movie is in theaters, right? And I remember looking around, and the employees at the zoo, of course, they had uniforms they wore, but everybody else, I mean, and I mean everybody, it wasn't just the kids, it was the parents. It was just everybody I could see in my line of sight was wearing a black t-shirt. I had one on too with the big yellow oval with the black bat inside of the oval, you know what I mean? And in my humble opinion, like the 80s was kind of over by 1989. And I could do a whole other video about that, but a lot of the imagery and stuff that a person might associate with the 80s, it kind of those fads had kind of died down by then. You know what I mean? But one of the remnants was I remember looking around that day at the zoo and a bunch of the other bat t-shirts I was seeing, the oval around the bat logo was like a neon color. I went with a friend of mine named Dirk, and his was either fluorescent orange or fluorescent green. I can't remember now. But I just remember looking around, and the only color I didn't see was blue. It was like every other color of the rainbow was there. You know what I mean? But I didn't see any blue ovals. And I remember thinking that was weird, especially because Batman wore so much blue in the comics and, the Batmobile was blue and all that jazz. But at any rate, yeah, like people loved the movie so much that they were willing to walk around in the sun on like a record hot day just to have a Batman t-shirt on. That was how much people loved the movie. I remember seeing the 89 movie in the theater and just it blew my mind because it was so different than everything we'd had up until that point. Like I loved the Christopher Reeve movies and I had a lot of friends who they walked into that theater loving Christopher Reeve and they came out talking trash about the Christopher Reeve movies. And I never liked that. I was never that guy. I still liked it. I just thought they were apples and oranges. But but I will say this, when you watch the Christopher Reeve movies, like for instance, I had been to Niagara Falls to some of the locations where they were filming some of the stuff from the second movie when he goes to Niagara Falls. So Christopher Reeve to me felt like it took place in my world that I lived in, right? I didn't feel that way with Batman at all. Gotham City to me didn't feel like it could exist on my planet. It was otherworldly and it was strange and fascinating and I remember walking out of the theater and the only way I can think of explaining it is like if you've ever gone swimming and then you get out of the water and you just feel heavy because you're not weightless anymore like you were in the pool. You know what I mean? And maybe you're walking to the locker room to get a shower or whatever, but you just feel heavy. And maybe the temperature in the pool is nice. And now, especially if you go swimming in the summer, maybe you're hot and stuff like that. That's kind of in a way what it was like to come out of the movie theater. I felt just for me, like I walked out into the parking lot and it was record breaking hot for sure. And I had been in a nice air conditioned movie theater, but also it was like all of the cool architecture and stuff like that of Gotham City was gone. Um, it was like a roller coaster ride and now it's over. And I remember going home and finding coffee can. I don't think they even make them out of metal anymore. But my grandparents had, I don't know if it was like Folgers coffee or something like that, but they had this big coffee can and cut. I went out to my grandpa's garage and I got a hold of some tools and I cut a hole in the bottom of that coffee can. And then I had a little lamp in my bedroom and I took the lampshade off of it and I put the coffee can over top of it. And then on the lid was made out of transparent plastic. I took a permanent marker and I drew the bat symbol on it. So I made my own um bat signal that could shine on my ceiling at night. That was kind of my night light that summer, was I had the bat signal on my ceiling, you know? Um, and then I think I painted the can black or blue or something like that. Uh, and then something else that was awesome about that movie was I remember on the local news, which, our TV stations that we could get were all out of Cleveland, and on, I think it was the Channel 5 News, they had an interview with a guy who had been, like, a little kid when the Adam West Batman show was on TV, which I'd never seen that before, and then they started showing that in reruns. I'll get to that in a second here. But at any rate, so this guy had been a fan of the Adam West show, and he had been collecting Batman memorabilia this whole time, you know, and they had him on the news, and he was talking about how much his collection was worth. And I remember watching that with my mom, and so up until that point, my mom had decided when I hit a certain age, and I can't remember now how old I was, if I was like 10 or 12 or somewhere in that general ballpark of time. I remember her just cutting me off and saying, "You're too old for toys. You know, you shouldn't be buying Transformers anymore. It's weird. I don't want my kid to be a weirdo." You know, she'd say stuff like that. And then she saw this guy on the news being kind of celebrated, and he was an adult and he was buying Batman toys. You know what I mean? And so for my mom, it just everything clicked. And she was like, "Oh my God, you should collect Batman stuff. Look how much that's worth, you know. You should buy stuff now and it's going to be worth a bunch of money in the future." And I was like, "Okay, sounds great." And so I remember my mom was suddenly, you know, she went from being very anti toy to an extent kind of anti pop culture. She was really trying to push me more in the direction of, "Why don't you collect CDs?" and you know what I mean, stuff like that. Um at any rate, we went out and they had toys for the Batman movie. I bought those. Um, they were kind of, I can't remember the specifics now, but they were re-releasing the Kenner Superpower stuff, but I think it was like another company had the rights by then. Someone in the comments, I'm sure, will correct me on it. I can't quite place if that was Toy Biz or who that was doing that now. But I started to pick up certain action figures that I didn't have before, you know? Um, and then I started buying, you know, GI Joes and Transformers and things like that again. So I was thankful that the movie had that effect. And now there were suddenly comic book stores around. And so this was a big one, is in the town that is closest to where I live now, um, a comic book store popped up. And right around that same time is when the new Robin made his first appearance, who was Tim Drake, which is kind of, you know, what that was the impetus for this video. Um, so I think it was partially to promote him. I think it was partially to ride the popularity of the 89 movie. They got somebody to paint him in the front window of the store. I think they used an overhead projector and then, like, traced it because it was just absolutely perfect. It just looked exactly like the art in the comic book. The first panel where you see him in uniform for the first time, um, that is exactly what was, you know, the front of the store was all glass, and so that was painted on the glass, and that was there for years. And he kinda became the store mascot, and interestingly enough, then eventually that's the store that I bought. So, you know, I was going there as a 13-year-old kid in '89, and then 10 years later in '99, I owned the place, you know? Um, so when I think of Tim Drake, I can't help but think of my old store. and then that store existing, it started to bring friends together. There are guys that I still talk to this day, um, that the reason we met was because we were hanging out at that store. And so 1989 was this big moment for our role-playing game because I don't wanna say it breathed new life into it, the game wasn't dead or anything, but, I mean, the number of players suddenly doubled, and people who had no real interest in superheroes before suddenly were interested in superheroes. You know what I mean? Um, and I would argue too that if you compare the '89 Batman movie, because like, Marvel in 1989, if you look at what Marvel was doing in terms of movies, it's not so good, right? Um, I would argue that it's flip-flopped in recent years, but that your opinions, your mileage may vary. But at any rate, for sure, in 1989, there were not a lot of fantastic Marvel movies floating around out there, right? It took Marvel a little while, I think, to get the ball rolling. But if you think about um, Blade and that first X-Men movie, and if you think about kind of the look and the vibe that those movies have, and then you look at the Michael Keaton Batman, I personally think there's a lot of overlap, right? So I would argue that the Keaton movie sort of paved the way for the Marvel Cinematic Universe era. You know what I mean? And and I will say this, by 1989, we'd gotten the last of the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, and I could do a whole video about that, but uh the company that was doing that movie was kinda circling the drain while they were filming the movie. There were a bunch of budget problems, yada, yada, yada. I could go on about it, but so that movie did not do well, right? And I think that left a bad taste in people's mouth when it came to superheroes. And in general, not everybody, nothing's ever unanimous hardly, but you know what I mean? And then, the TV shows that I'd grown up with, whether it was like, the Linda Carter Wonder Woman or, the Lou Ferrigno Incredible Hulk show or, the Nicholas Handman Spider-Man show or, whatever it was, all those ships felt like they had sailed, you know? And so when Batman hit, it genuinely did just feel like a new era, and it just kind of like I think it sort of supercharged the fandom in a way. So, and I've never heard anybody say this, but I think that because people were exploring Batman for the first time, that before that they had this idea of like I mentioned the Squirrel Man idea earlier. I think that's where a lot of people were at. And again, not everybody, but a chunk. And so for the first time, they understood what Batman had originally been about all those years earlier, right? The Golden Age Batman, what he was doing, and that this was kind of a return to form in terms of because I feel like the average Joe on the street had no idea who Frank Miller was. After the '89 movie came out, then I think people were going back and then they were hearing who Frank Miller was for a lot of people, for the general public. Um, and if you're listening to this and you're like, "Well, I knew who Frank Miller was in 1986," that's fantastic. I think you're ahead of the curve then. I just think the average person on the street is not as well versed in everything, right? That's what I'm saying. But so, um, I think people were curious about Batman, and then I think one of those questions that was kind of in the air, kinda like the elephant in the room, was even people who didn't know much about Batman were very familiar with the phrase Batman and Robin, right? And so they'd seen the Batman movie and they were like, "Well, hold up. What's what's the deal with Robin then? There's no Robin in that movie." I heard that a lot as a kid. And almost as soon as the movie was out, making a ton of money. I heard time and time again it was the biggest movie ever made, the most successful movie ever made. It made the most money of any movie ever, yada yada yada. And I was immediately hearing people talking about the sequel. Like, yes, give us more money. We definitely want another one of these. And so one of those rumors that started to come out was, oh, Robin is going to be in the sequel, and the sequel is going to be called Batman and Robin. It's going to be awesome. And we don't know when it's going to come out, if it's going to come out in 1990 or 1991 or what, but you know. And of course that didn't happen that way. We didn't get Robin when Batman Returns did hit. Batman Returns, I like the movie, but it's not everybody's cup of tea, and that'd be a whole other thing. But at any rate, in 1989, though, I think there was interest in Robin that had not been there before. And which is not to insult Dick Grayson. I love the character of Dick Grayson. Um, he's not my favorite Robin. He kind of lays the groundwork, but I felt like the character was almost like a prototype in a way. And then you get to Jason Todd, which I think most people had no idea there even was ever a Jason Todd. Again, I'm talking about the general public and not necessarily the guy who's going to a comic shop every week. Um, and he'd kind of come and gone. And I think that the idea of Robin was so poorly received that when they had people call in to vote whether Jason Todd should live or die, people voted to kill the character off. They didn't like him back then. Um, so they did. And now all of a sudden people were kind of like, well, hey, we thought there was a Robin. And I think on DC's end, they're like, well, what do we do? Do we have Nightwing go back to being Robin? You got to explain a bunch of stuff, blah, blah, blah. And I think that they decided to make Tim Drake, and this is just my opinion. And I don't know also how far in advance the planning for that had to go. I don't know if they were planning for it before the movie came out and they just had seen enough of the movie that they felt like it was going to be a hit, or I don't know, right? But I for sure just felt like the Tim Drake Robin kind of scratched that itch. And then they redesigned the suit, and I always thought that was them kind of trying out what a movie Robin might look like. And that might sound weird to some people, but I have heard my friends who work in the comic book industry have for sure said that that's what Marvel did with Ultimates. Is when Marvel knew that they were going to get into the movie business, they made the Ultimates comics as kind of like a sketch of what they thought the MCU was going to look like. And that's at the time, as of like the year 2000, that's what they thought the MCU was going to look like. And then some of the stuff from Ultimates did make it to the big screen, right? Some of it did not. It was kind of hit and miss. But I thought that's what they were doing with Tim Drake. I thought he was kind of them feeling out the idea of an on-screen Robin. Um, I also always kind of got the vibe that they might have had Johnny Depp in mind, a younger Johnny Depp, obviously, um, to play Tim Drake. I think some of the visual cues of the character are kind of along those lines. I kind of wonder if the whole Tim Burton Edward Scissorhands connection, I wonder if that was maybe um kind of a catalyst for certain artists after that to kind of maybe lean in that direction. But at any rate, I really liked Tim Drake. I thought he was really cool. I'm kind of sad because in our game, when Batman Beyond came out, Batman Beyond was very, very popular. with our players, and we had people wanting to use Terry McGinnis in the game, and so I didn't say no to him. I was like, "That's fine, we can do Terry McGinnis." Um, but then that means that, uh, Tim Drake's time then as kind of a relevant character ends up being kinda short. And then the other thing was, I've never heard anybody say this, I've always just assumed it was true, but I thought that Batman the Animated Series, that when the '89 movie did really, really well, I assumed that Warner Brothers was like, "We need a cartoon to go along with this," because that was just kinda how they used to do things back in the day. And so I always thought the animated series started off as basically Batman '89, the animated series, and then just the deeper into that they got, the more it became its own thing. So certainly by the time it's over with, it's not like they're animating the '89 Batmobile, for instance, you know what I mean? But there's kind of a vibe there though that I think for sure, the two are not working independent in vacuums of one another. But at any rate, the Batman the Animated Series was really, really popular with our players. So they were already into that when Batman Beyond came out. Um, so then that also meant part of our Tim Drake thing follows the cartoon at times. So some of the stuff we do with Tim Drake is more comic oriented. There's kind of an ebb and a flow with the character then. Some of it is more cartoon. And then the same with Batman, we had to then explain because, we had people that liked the Frank Miller Batman, and we were taking parts of that we liked, like Carrie Kelly, for instance. We had already had her as a Robin, and then we got rid of her to make way for Tim Drake. Um, but in 1989, we started pushing Batman in the direction of the movie, but we didn't fully go there. So, for instance, our Batman in 1989 has the movie Batmobile because that's just a really cool car. We thought, how can you not use the car? You know what I mean? Um, but then there were other things we were doing from the comics, like, having Tim Drake around. Obviously, he's not in the movies. Um, what was I gonna say? I kind of derailed there. Um, well, at any rate, so we introduced our version of Tim Drake for the Christmas of 1989. And the idea in our game is that um, people in Gotham City seem to just go postal at random and they go on a killing spree. And it doesn't make any sense. Batman is investigating this. And of course, our Batman at this point in our timeline, our Batman is Dick Grayson. He's about 60 years old at this point. So he's slowing down, and then that was kind of part of our explanation for some of he's not wearing like a spandex suit anymore. It is more like the movie suit now, where it's hard and can take a gunshot if it needs to. And at any rate, he's on the case. He's trying to figure out who done it, and he figures out it has something to do with greeting cards. That somebody is lacing these greeting cards with a chemical that is causing this stuff to happen. And he traces it back to like the greeting card factory basically and walks into a trap, which was very 1966 Batman actually. So he's hanging upside down when the villain is revealed to be the Scarecrow. And the Scarecrow basically says he came up with this chemical, he was trying it out. Uh that's what it did. So when your grandma got a Christmas card in the mail, she attacked grandpa, that kind of thing. And at any rate, then he uses a new kind of fear gas on Batman and Batman starts hallucinating that there are spiders all over him, biting him and stuff like that. And again, Batman's hanging upside down by his ankles, and uh, the Scarecrow is kind of watching with glee. And meanwhile, Tim Drake, who is a player character, has also been looking at the evidence, and he figures everything out. He goes to the scene, he beats up the Scarecrow, he saves Batman. He is worthy to be Robin then. So the adventure, even though it took, the better part of a Saturday afternoon to play that out, for me to tell you about that part of it, yeah, it just doesn't last that long. And then he was our Robin. And he was a popular character. He showed up a lot throughout the 90s. Different people played him. Some people wanted him to wear the suit from the comics. Some people wanted him to wear what he wore on Batman the Animated Series, where it's more of like a red and black kind of thing with no green. A couple other guys kind of had their own take on what they thought the Robin suit should look like. So it's kind of like in the recent Flash movie where there's like a vault full of multiple bat suits for different occasions. We just gave Robin a vault and it had multiple suits for multiple occasions. Um, but yeah, that's pretty much it for my memories of the Tim Drake character. For my memories of the '89 Batman movie. I'm trying to think of anything. 'Cause it was just, man, that was like a huge movie. I'm trying to think what I'd be leaving out there. Um I don't know if I said it, but just man, that really helped our game out. A lot of guys that were kind of too cool for school, after that Batman movie came out, those guys were wanting to be friends with me. They were wanting to play in the game, that kind of thing. Um, yeah. So that was just an awesome summer, despite it being such a hot summer. That was just one of the best summers ever. I remember the summer of '89 vividly. And I would love to hear your memories of this stuff. Uh, were you old enough? Did you see the '89 movie in the theater? What did you think of it? Did you have any cool memories from the summer of '89? Maybe you're a younger listener. Maybe you weren't alive yet in 1989. Um, I'd be curious what your first exposure to Batman would be. I would think that there's probably a lot of listeners actually who grew up on the animated series or they grew up listening to Kevin Conroy, which, man, I loved Kevin Conroy. I was actually due to meet him a week after he passed away. They announced he couldn't make it because he passed away, and me and my whole family were heartbroken, man. We were like so excited to go meet Batman. Um, but at any rate, I think a lot of people probably grew up on Kevin Conroy, whether through the animated series or the various direct to video movies DC put out or video games or what have you. And I bet there's a lot of guys who just can't wrap their head around the idea that there would ever be anyone anywhere that was not a Batman fan at some point. But yeah, for me, we were not Batman fans when we were younger. Not until the '89 movie. But yeah, let me know in the comments what was your thing, with Batman. I'd love to hear about it. As always, check to see if you're still subscribed because YouTube loves to unsubscribe people without telling them. I hear it from people all the time. And smash that like button. That helps us out. And that's about it for me for this one. From everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.